These are quiet accounts from old shipping lanes, lighthouse rocks, fishing grounds, and harbor towns, told in the unhurried order kept by people who worked on the water and later carried one impossible detail home. Nothing here arrives through storm or violence, because the sea is calm in every account, and ordinary work goes on around the wrongness. The lamps are trimmed, the watch is set, and a long night of slow water lies ahead. We begin east of Speedwell Island in November of 1884, aboard the bark Dawn of Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. On a windless morning, she found the brigantine Speedwell standing under one topsail, with nobody at the wheel, and when her mate crossed the still water to investigate, he found every object in order, and one measure of time that could not be made to agree with another. My grandfather's name was Obed Can, and he went to sea out of Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, a town at the southwestern tip of that province that owned an extraordinary deep-water fleet in the 1880s. He was mate of a bark called the Dawn, named for a daughter of the owning family. And a bark is a vessel of 3 masts carrying square sails on the first 2 and fore and aft canvas on the third. He told this account to my father on winter nights with the stove drawing well, and my father told it to me years later in the same kitchen, and between all the tellings not one detail ever moved, which in my family is the mark of a story being true. In the first week of November of 1884, the Dawn went out from St. John, New Brunswick, loaded deep with sawn spruce for Liverpool, and shaped her course to pass east of Speedwell Island. Speedwell is a long, low bar of sand about 100 miles off the Nova Scotia coast, with dune grass and wild ponies, but neither rock nor harbor, and the men of that coast treated it with the courtesy of distance. The first days of the passage were ordinary. November, gray and hard sailing, and my grandfather stood his watches and thought nothing that anyone would want the story about. On the 10th day out, the wind died away, and that is where this begins, because a flat calm east of Speedwell in November is a rare article. By morning, only a long southern swell remained, slow and smooth and far apart, while high clouds showed plainly in the quiet water and the barometer glass stood high and would not stir. The sails hung slack and slatted softly against the masts when she rolled, and the patent log line hung straight down from the stern rail, its little brass spinner having no miles to count. A little after 7 bells of the morning, Watch the lookout raised a sail to the southeast, and he called it down in an easy voice, because a sail is company on that water and nothing more. She lay perhaps 3 miles off, a brigantine, which is a 2-masted vessel carrying her square sails on the foremast only, and she stood under shortened canvas. One topsail set, and the rest of her cloth furled snug and seamanlike, and she made no way, there being no wind for either of them. My grandfather went up into the rigging with the long glass, and the first thing he found was that her wheel stood unmanned. And the strange part was that nothing else about her said trouble, for no signal flew from her, and her yards were squared with care, and a vessel in distress is not tidy. They hoisted their number and watched her a long while, and no answer came, and no smoke rose from her galley stack, and nothing moved on her deck but the slow lift of the swell going under her. Captain Reuben Dawn, the master, a heavy, quiet man who had been in ships since he was 11 years old, kept the glass on her for the better part of an hour, and then he said, in the voice he used for choosing an anchorage, that the mate would take the boat and go and see. My grandfather took 2 men, Amos Treffry of Barrington, and a young Dane whose name he never could keep hold of, and they went down into the boat and pulled across. He said that pull stayed with him all his life, because their own oars were the only sound on all that water, the blades going in and coming out, and the drops running off between strokes. And when they rested on their oars to look at her, there was nothing to hear at all, nothing near and nothing far. And a man does not often get to listen to the open Atlantic saying nothing. Her stern carried her name and port in good gilt letters, Speedwell of St. Well. John's, which is the old harbor city on the east coast of Newfoundland, and my grandfather said the home lettering took a little of the strangeness off her, though it did not keep it off for long. They came under her quarter and hailed, and got silence, and hailed again, and got it again. So my grandfather went up her side with Treffery after him, and the Dane lay off in the boat, which was the custom, and good sense besides. Her deck was in order from stem to stern. Every line was made up on its pin. The hatches were battened and wedged. The wheel was lashed with a neat piece of small stuff, and both of her boats sat on their chocks under laced covers. And that was the first fact that would not sit still in his mind, because a crew that leaves a vessel at sea goes in the boats, and the Speedwell's boats had never left her. He went below by the after companion with Treffery at his shoulder, calling ahead of himself down the stair, slow and friendly, the call a man gives coming into another man's house. The cabin was dry and orderly, with the light coming down mild through the skylight, and the table was laid for four. The fiddles were shipped, which are the little rails that keep dishes aboard a table in a seaway, and 4 places were set, and there was tea in the pot. Forward in the galley, the stove stood quiet, and my grandfather laid the back of his hand against the kettle on it, and the kettle was warm. Not hot, but honestly warm, the warmth of a fire let die within the morning, and he stood there with his hand against it for a good while, because somebody had to have lit that stove, and the ship around him held nobody who could have. They searched her end to end twice over, 2 quiet men getting quieter. In the forecastle, every bunk was made up, and every sea chest sat in its place, and the oilskins hung on their pegs with the sea boots under them. And on a shelf lay somebody's pipe with the tobacco in it half smoked, and a jersey with a darning needle resting in the wool, the mend half run. The hold was stowed full of salt fish, dry and sweet, bound for Gibraltar for orders as it later proved, and when they tried the pumps, she sucked dry on the first strokes, a sound, tight vessel, with nothing in her bilges but what a tight vessel carries. There was no disorder anywhere, and no mark of hurry, and there was nobody aboard. On the cabin desk lay her log, written up in good ink in an even, schooled hand, each day ruled off below the last, her position and the weather set down with the day's work under them, and the record ran fair and complete to a date 11 days gone. On that day the entry began in its usual form, and it stopped partway through a sentence, between one word and the next, with the rest of the page clean, and the pen lying dry in the tray beside the book. The last position she gave put her better than 300 miles to the northeast of where she now lay. And I want to set the 2 facts side by side for you plainly, because the whole of the story lives in the space between them. And when my grandfather reached this part, he would say them together and then say nothing for a while. The log was 11 days old, and the kettle was warm. He did what a careful man does, which is arithmetic, and he raked the firebox and found live coal under gray ash. The chronometer, the exact clock carried for navigation, had run down and therefore agreed with 11 days, while the water was sweet and the bread was hard. Everything aboard the Speedwell agreed with 11 days, except the stove, which could keep its warmth for 1 morning at the most, and there was no arithmetic that seated those 2 measures in the same ship. He went back on deck in his own time, and after they pulled home, he made his report to Captain Don at the rail, with the crew drifting aft to hear it. A sound brigantine with a freight of salt fish meant salvage money, and every hand knew that a share of the Speedwell might exceed a year's wages. Captain Don asked for 4 men to work her into Halifax, but no man said yes, and he did not ask twice. My grandfather always made it clear that they were competent sailors who had worked aloft in hard weather without complaint. Yet the calm was another matter, because every man had heard about the Kettle, and none would stand a middle watch above a warm stove whose fire belonged to nobody. So they stood by her instead, the 2 vessels lying a quarter-mile apart on that smooth water through the short afternoon. And toward evening, a small air came in from the southwest, barely enough to give steerage, and both ships took a little life. Captain Don kept his vessel hove close through the dark, and they burned a lamp in the rigging, and the Speedwell showed nothing. And my grandfather had the middle watch, which is the black stretch from midnight to 4 in the morning, and he spent most of it at the rail with the glass. There was a piece of a moon behind the cloud, and he could make out the loom of her a long while, dark and patient and riding easy off the quarter. And then late in the watch, the cloud came down lower, and he could not. By daylight, the air had freshened into a proper sailing breeze, and the Speedwell was nowhere on the horizon. And I will not tell you that part is past explaining. Because a vessel with a topsail set moves when the wind moves her, and nobody living could say what the night had done with her head or her helm. Captain Don worked out on the slate where the breeze ought to have carried her, and they ran down that line the whole forenoon with a man at each masthead and raised nothing at all. And at noon, he gave it up and put the Alma Dawn back on her course for Liverpool, because the spruce was owed to men who had paid for it, and owners do not pay crews to quarter empty ocean, and that is not hardness, only the trade. At Liverpool, the captain made his deposition, and Lloyd's in London posted the Speedwell missing, and in the fullness of winter the underwriters paid, and the 8 men of her company were given up with her. There was never an inquiry worth the name, because here there was nothing to sit in judgment on, except a tidy vessel and a warm kettle, and no court keeps a form for that. What stayed with my grandfather was neither the empty deck nor the log with its broken sentence, but the kettle. For the rest of his life, he could not enter a kitchen without laying the back of his hand against the kettle on his way past, and my grandmother knew what the touch meant and never remarked on it. When he found warmth, he would stand a moment with his hand there and look at nothing and then go on about his business, and my father caught the habit from him without deciding to, and I caught it from my father. He finished the story the same way, every telling. He would say that the sea east of Sable is better than 2 miles deep and lies quiet in November about once in 10 years, and that whatever came to the Speedwell's people came softly, because 8 seamen do not leave a vessel in a flat calm with the fiddles shipped. He would say the ship herself was let alone, and the breakfast laid, and the stove fed. Then he would put 1 more stick in his own stove and bank it careful for the night. And my father said he understood, from the first time he heard the story, the reason his father banked it so carefully, which was so that in the morning, when he came down and put his hand to the kettle, the warmth in it would be his own, and accounted for. That is the whole of it, and it is enough, and the water tonight is lying just about that quiet, a long way out, holding the clouds in it, with nothing on it moving. That was Obed Can's account of the Alma Dawn and the brigantine Speedwell, found becalmed 3 miles away on the North Atlantic. The strangers' boats remained covered on their chocks, 4 places waited at the table, and her log ended in the middle of a sentence dated 11 days earlier. Yet the kettle on her galley stove was warm. The Almadon stood by through the night, but a light breeze carried the empty vessel beyond every search before morning, and Obed spent the rest of his life touching each kettle he passed so that its warmth would be accounted for. From the open Atlantic we go east to Corby Rock, a black outcrop beyond Scotland's outer Heb, Rich Dees, where 3 lighthouse keepers lived by the clockwork of an oil lamp. In December of 1901, the relief tender Signet approached under a high glass and an easy swell, and nobody waited at the landing. The outer Hebrides are the last islands off the northwest of Scotland, and 15 miles west of them stands Corby Rock, named for the old Scots word for a crow, because the rock is black. Beyond it there is only open Atlantic until America, and in winter the sea crosses the bare top, while the nearest household lamps remain below the eastern horizon. The rock is scarcely bigger than a church, but in the 1890s the Northern Lighthouse Board raised a tower there and kept 3 men living on it. This is about those men and my grandfather, who was meant to become the 4th. The keepers worked 6 weeks on the rock and a fortnight ashore, while their families lived at Carlew Way on the island of Lewis. Relief went out aboard the board's tender Signet when weather allowed, and the landing was only a shelf of rock with steps and a crane above them, so there were seasons when the tender had to carry its relief home again. In December of 1901, my grandfather, Murdo Morrison, was ashore, and on the morning of the 18th, he stood aboard the Signet on his way back to take up his watch. The 3 on the rock that turned were the principal keeper, James McKeever, who had kept the Corby light from the night it was first shown, and had written its log for 11 years in a hand, so even that the board's inspectors used to open the book just to show it to new men. And the second keeper, in Ross, and an occasional keeper, a young man named John Muffail, who was filling the turn while the regular man mended a broken wrist ashore. They were Lewis men, quiet and exact and long in the service, and I set that down at the start because of what I have to tell you further on, and because no part of it was ever, by anyone serious, laid at their door. The light was an oil lamp standing inside a cage of cut glass that turned by clockwork around the flame. A weight on a chain drove the mechanism and descended slowly through the tower, and the keeper wound it back to the top every 2 hours before checking the oil and cutting the char from each wick. Between windings he watched the flame, and after his watch he left the weather on a slate for the principal to copy into the log each morning. It was small, faithful work done on time, every night for years, and the men were proud of a trade noticed only when it failed. The weather that December was fine, which at Corby in midwinter was nearly unheard of. For a fortnight, the glass stood high, the southern wind stayed light, and the swell ran long and low, and men at Carlew Way remarked upon the settled spell when they met along the road. Every coastal light has a character that identifies it in darkness, and Corby showed 2 white flashes every half-minute. Fishermen from Carlew Way and a trawler master who passed close on the 14th later agreed that it showed on time at dusk, kept its proper flashes through the night, and went out at daybreak throughout that calm fortnight, so nothing was reported wrong because nothing showed wrong. The Cygnet reached the rock before 10 on the morning of December 18th, riding the easiest swell her master had ever found at Corby. On relief day, 1 keeper usually waited at the crane, and 2 stood above the steps for mail and tobacco. But that morning, the crane stood empty. The master anchored off the landing and gave the familiar low note of the steam whistle, and it rolled off the rock and returned small, while the tower door stayed shut, and nobody came out. My grandfather went ashore with the Cygnet's mate and 1 seaman, calling ahead as he climbed the familiar steps. The door was latched but not barred, and inside the storeroom stood in order. The kitchen was swept, the dishes were racked, and the grate held ashes gray enough to mean days rather than hours. The made beds offered no date, and the running station clock settled nothing, because its 8-day movement could have been wound by any keeper during the regular week. All 3 suits of oilskins hung above all 3 pairs of sea boots, however, and those boots mattered beside the fortnight of calm, because no keeper walked wet rock on a December night in stocking feet. In the little room below the lamp, where the books were kept, the log lay open on the desk, with the pen dry in the tray beside it, and the record in James McKeever's even hand ran complete, each day ruled off below the last, through the 9th of December. The entry for the 9th began in its familiar form. The light put out at 6 minutes past 8. The wind light airs from the south, the glass steady, the sea smooth, and then the forenoon work begun, and the sentence stopped partway through a word. As near as anyone could ever judge, the word was going to be cleaning, and the ink had feathered a little where the nib rested before it was lifted, and after it there was nothing at all, only the clean ruled page. That entry was written on the morning of the 9th, and the Cygnet came to the rock on the 18th. So hold those 9 days a moment, because everything I have told you so far could be carried by ordinary sorrow, and the 9 days cannot. They climbed into the lantern room in broad winter daylight, and the lamp was burning with a clean, even flame. Its freshly trimmed wicks had left the glass bright. The oil reservoir stood full, although that pattern of lamp emptied it in 1 night, and the clockwork weight hung near the top of its chain, newly wound. The great glass turned at its proper rate and sent 2 pale flashes over their heads every half minute, while the men stood quiet. 9 days had passed since a hand wrote in the log, yet the light had been lit at dusk, trimmed and wound through every watch, and put out at dawn throughout those nights, and here it burned on the 10th morning with nobody on the rock. They searched the rock, which does not take long, for there is nothing on Corby but the tower and the shelf and the steps and the bare black top of it, and they found nothing moved and nothing marked. The crane stood in its canvas jacket, lashed for the winter in Muckheaver's own fashion of lashing. The weed on the lower steps lay whole and unbroken, and weed tears and scuffs when men or seas go over it, and neither men nor seas had. And the sea all around lay long and low and smooth, and gave them nothing, that day or any day after. The lamp had to be put out, because it was day, and putting it out was the duty of the keeper coming on watch, and the keeper coming on watch was my grandfather. He had put that lamp out some hundreds of mornings by then, and lit it some hundreds of evenings, and he did it the regular way, in the regular order, and when it was done, he said, "Thank you" to it. Out loud, in the hearing of the cygnet's mate, and the mate took off his cap, and neither of them ever pretended afterward that it had been a strange thing to do. The board's inquiry found that some freak run of sea had taken all 3 men from the landing after the 9th, and my grandfather did not quarrel in public because the finding secured the Carlew families their pensions. In private, he said only that the oilskins and boots remained inside. The sea had been flat for a fortnight, and the finding said nothing about the lamp. And then he lit his pipe and closed the subject. He took up the light that same evening, because whatever else was true, dusk was coming on, and the light had to show, and 2 of the cygnet's men stood the first turns with him until proper keepers could be landed after the new year. He lit the lamp with his own match, and it behaved, and it went on behaving every night after that, through all the 10 more years he served on Corby. A lamp, and nothing besides a lamp. He kept the log himself from then on. Each day ruled off below the last, and he finished every sentence he ever began in it, and at the foot of every page he signed his name, which the regulations did not ask of any keeper. And when a new man once asked him the reason, he told him that a kept light ought to know who was keeping it. Corby became automatic in 1963, and the old lamp went into a museum at Store Na, way with its trimming scissors, brass oil measure, and a card giving the old character of 2 white flashes every half-minute. I once stood before the case while harbor sounds came through the window, and I saw that the wick was trimmed, although I did not ask who kept it so. Out on the rock, the new light now wakes at dusk and turns through every night with nobody in the tower. And fishermen think nothing of a kept light without a keeper, because that is ordinary now, while the old Carlew families remember the 9 nights when it was ordinary before. That was the Corby rock light, where the keeper's log stopped in the middle of a word 9 days before the tender arrived. Their oilskins and sea boots remained inside. The winter sea had stayed low, and through every missing night, fishermen saw the proper pair of white flashes turn over the water. Murdo Morrison entered the lantern room in broad daylight and found the lamp burning with trimmed wicks, a full reservoir, and freshly wound clockwork, although no keeper remained to tend it. He kept the light for another decade, finished every sentence in the station log, and signed each page so the lamp would know who had kept it. Our next account crosses to the Shumagin Islands of Alaska in the summer of 1907, where the survey steamer Marmot was measuring deep water for a new chart. The youngest man at her lead was Niels Sorensen, and during one pale summer night, his marked line found a bottom that daylight never found. This one my father had from a neighbor, and I will give you the kitchen before the sea." In Ballard, the part of Seattle where Scandinavian families settled and the halibut fleet tied up, there lived a man named Niels Sorensen. In the summer of 1907, when he was 20, Niels held the lead aboard a survey steamer called the Marmot, and he later told what he saw from her rail over coffee at our kitchen table. He always chose the long summer light for the telling, and kept every particular fixed, while nobody in our family remarked upon his refusal to tell it during winter darkness. The Marmot belonged to the Coast and Geodetic Survey, the government service that measured the coasts and made charts. Alaska needed those charts because canneries were opening along the salmon rivers, and the fishing fleet came north each spring into waters last sounded by the Russians before the American purchase. Those old sheets were honest but sparse, with scattered figures and broad reaches marked unsurveyed. That season, the Marmot worked among the green, treeless Shumagin Islands off the Alaska Peninsula, using the cannery wharf at Sandpoint on Popoff Island, across from the old village of Unga, where Aleut and Norwegian families had shared the shore for generations. The work filled the long July daylight, and boats carried driftwood tripods and white cloth to the hilltops, where the surveyors raised signals that officers aboard could cut with their sextants. Plane table men walked the shores, and the steamer ran measured lines between them, while the crew worked long and slept in the pale nights. Even the usual Shumagin fog stayed away for weeks, and Niels said the older hands grew half suspicious of such sustained kindness. Niels's post was the lead, and the whole account runs through his two hands. A lead line carries a narrow weight on a line marked at known fathoms, with pieces of leather and calico arranged so a man can read the depth wet and in darkness by touch, and each fathom measures 6 feet. The leadsman casts ahead of the vessel, feels for the weight to touch, calls the depth, and gathers the line again until those actions enter his arms without deliberate thought. A hollow in the weight is packed with hard mutton fat called tallow, and when the lead touches ground, the tallow brings back a print of sand, shell, or mud. An experienced officer can identify his neighborhood from that small print, even when fog has removed every landmark. The survey therefore recorded the bottom beside the depth, and its new chart would tell skippers what their own leads ought to find beneath them for decades afterward. Southwest of Unga, the Russian chart carried one remark: no bottom at 100 fathoms, and the Marmot's daytime work agreed, cast after cast. Her heavier offshore lead ran to the final mark and swung free, returning with clean tallow each time, which was ordinary deep water off Alaska, where the seafloor falls beyond the reach of the old lines. The only detail a man might have noticed was that Unga's boats pulled an extra mile around the stretch on their way home and lay north of it overnight. Aleut and Norwegian crews followed that bend together without making a display of it, although nobody aboard the Marmot noticed then, and nobody ashore offered a reason. In the third week of July, the Marmot spent a night lying to over that ground, so that the offshore work could begin at first light, and lying to is to say, stopped. With her fires banked low, and the ship drifting easy on a smooth sea, and on such a night, the standing order was a cast of the lead every hour, to keep account of how the drift was setting her. Niels had the middle watch, which is the watch from midnight to 4 in the morning, and he made the midnight cast half asleep on his feet, having made 1,000 that summer, and the lead brought up short, and when he read the line against the lantern it said 15 fathoms. He supposed first that the line had fouled, so he hauled in and found it clear, armed the lead fresh, and cast again, clean. Watching the marks go out through his fingers, and it read 15 fathoms again, in water, the chart and the ship's own books, both called bottomless, at 100. And when he brought the lead inboard and turned it up to the lantern, the arming carried a full, fair print of smooth gray clay, and the clay was warm. Niels was exact about that warmth, because surface water there was cold enough to numb a man's hands within minutes, and grew colder with depth. The clay remained warm beneath his thumb while he carried it aft, and the officer of the watch tested it himself before saying quietly that they would make the next cast together. The officer of the watch was a young assistant named Mr. Hale, a correct and unhurried man, and he kept measuring because that was the survey answer to uncertainty. He checked the line himself, watched the fresh tallow go onto the lead, and signed his initials beside the first two figures, so no later reader could place the report upon the young leadsman alone. They cast every 20 minutes, and Niels penciled 15, then 14, then 13, then 12 and a half, while nothing disturbed the pale half-dark beyond the figures shortening in the book. Between casts, the lead lay on deck. The line was coiled again, and the ship drifted with her fires banked low. An engineer came up for air, heard the latest depth spoken between the two men, and returned below without a word to build his fires, leaving full steam ready, although nobody had ordered it, and the sounding continued. Somewhere past 3, with the northern sky already paling, for the July nights are short in that latitude, the figure stood at 11 fathoms through 2 casts running, and then the next cast read 13, and the one after it 17. And after that the march ran out through Niels's hands a little longer every time, and by the hour the sun was properly up. The deep-sea lead was swinging free again at its full 100 fathoms, and the arming came up smooth and unprinted and cold. In broad daylight, Mr. Hale fixed the ship by sextant angles to the signals ashore, and the night's drift came out at less than a mile, so they had lain over the same ground the whole time. And the Marmot then spent the morning running lines of soundings back and forth across the stretch, with a boat out as well working the hand lead along the edges, and the water was as deep as the Russians had left it, no bottom at 100 fathoms every cast. And by noon there was nothing to show for the night at all, but the column of figures in the sounding book, and a small dish of gray clay that Mr. Hale had covered over with a rag, and by noon the clay was cold. The chief heard the account that afternoon, had Niels tell it through from the first cast, thanked him for his care, and sent every depth and hour forward to Washington, because survey men do not omit figures. The small dish of clay went with the written season's records, covered and labeled, although by noon it had lost its warmth and become ordinary gray material. Yet a chart is a daylight document, and the sheet inked that winter carried the depths that answered whenever men returned to check. There was no column for the hour of a cast, so the chart still says no bottom at 100 fathoms, which is true in daylight, and nothing about the rest came back from Washington, which was not villainy, but filing. The Marmot had to lie there once more in late August, and when the midnight cast found 14 fathoms, Mr. Hale moved her 2 miles north, saying only that she would lie easier there. Afterward, the ship spent every night at anchor off Sand Point without a written order. Near the season's end, an old Unguk man named Fyodor, born under the Russian flag, told Niels that the ground held one depth by day and another by night, so a man minded his soundings and anchored in the evening. His father had told him that in Russian, and then he returned to mending his net, leaving Niels comforted by the thought that the change had gone on since before the charts, without becoming anything more than figures on a line. The remaining week settled back into survey work, with the Marmot raising steam before breakfast and putting her boats away beneath a sky that still held the pale remnant of night. Niels rinsed the lead after every run, picked old tallow from its hollow with a narrow wooden tool, and stretched the wet line along the rail so the marks would dry in their proper order. In the chart room, Mr. Hale reduced angles and copied columns while the paper edges lifted in the warmth of the lamp, and forward, the cook kept coffee ready for men returning from shore signals, with wet boots and grass seed on their clothes. Each evening, the deckhands washed mud from the boat floors, checked the falls, and coiled every sounding line for morning, because a kink left overnight could cost half an hour when the launch was waiting. The steamer then went in among the anchored fishing boats, her chain running out gently over ground already measured in daylight, and the watch heard small harbor sounds until the galley lamp went dark. Nothing about that routine denied the figures in Niels's book, and nothing required the crew to speak of them, so the season advanced by ordinary pages of depths, positions, stores used, and work completed. Niels came south that fall and fished halibut out of Ballard for 30 years, and all his life he anchored at night on ground he called honest. He never refused deep water, and never blamed a chart for giving only the measurement it had been made to give. But before dusk, he wanted the anchor holding upon a bottom his own lead had found in daylight. His daughter kept the survey sounding book, and on the copied page I have held, the figures descend and rise in a young man's pencil, while one small word stands beside midnight, warm. The paper holds no explanation, and needs none for the column to remain clear. Boats still work that water in summer daylight, and through the brief Alaska night, the fleet lies at anchor with every lead dry aboard, on honest ground. That was Niels Sorensen aboard the Marmot, taking soundings over water. The old chart marked beyond 100 fathoms. At midnight, his lead stopped at 15 fathoms and returned with smooth gray clay pressed into its tallow, and the clay held warmth in a sea cold enough to numb his hands. The recorded depth rose through the night and fell away again before sunrise, while every daylight cast found only the expected deep water. The chart kept the daylight figures, and Niels spent his later fishing years anchoring each evening on ground he called honest. The water now carries us south into the Pacific doldrums in 1923, where the trading schooner Winifred lay stopped, with a cargo of copra and no wind to take her home to Suva. On the fourth night, her watch looked down from the rail and saw a broad, pale light far below the keel. My grandfather went to sea from Auckland at 15 and stayed with it for close to 50 years, yet one piece of water remained apart from all the rest. He told me about it in his kitchen when I was 12, slowly and in careful order, while rain touched the glass and the stove ticked between his sentences. In 1923, he was an able seaman aboard the Winifred, a two-masted 98-ton schooner built of kauri timber and registered at Suva in the Fiji Islands for the copra trade. Copra is coconut meat, dried for keeping and shipped in sacks to mills that press it for oil. The Winifred had loaded it at 3 stations in the Low Gilbert Islands, north of the equator, with every sack brought through the surf in open boats. And by early November, she was full and sailing south for home. Her master was Alexander Rennie, a Scot with 30 years in the islands. Her mate was an Auckland man named Hartley, and the bosun was a Gilbertese sailor named Te Ana Ko, whom my grandfather called the finest seaman he ever shipped with. 6 more men stood before the mast and knew the little schooner's routines well. A few days south of the equator, the wind gave out in the doldrums, where the northern and southern trade winds fail before they meet, and a sailing vessel may lie stopped for a week. Heat settled into the Winifred, pitch softened in her deck seams, and slack canvas struck the masts with every roll, until Captain Rennie had the lighter sails stowed. The men rigged an awning over the main deck and worked beneath it through afternoons when metal fittings could not be held in a bare hand. The sweet smell of copra rose from the hold and spread through the forecastle, and my grandfather could recall it whole for the rest of his life. A stopped ship keeps her routine because routine is the ship. So the watches changed. The wheel was relieved. Although there was nothing to steer, the chronometer was wound at 8 bells, and Captain Rennie took a noon sight that showed only a few miles of current. The decks were washed, brass was polished, and meals crossed the swinging table on time. For 9 evenings, the master's log began with the word calm, written in the same small hand above another position, barely removed from the day before. In the cool mornings, they sometimes lowered both boats and towed her toward darker water to the south, and the oars entered the long, low swell with scarcely a sound. It was on the 4th night of the calm that he saw the light. He had the middle watch, which runs from midnight to 4 in the morning, and there was no moon, and the stars reached the water on every side. He was standing at the rail by the fore rigging, and he looked down, and under the ship there was a paleness in the sea. His first thought was the ordinary one, that it was the burning of the water, the phosphorescence that a moving hull stirs up in warm seas. And then he remembered that the Winifred had not moved in 4 days and had no wake to burn. The second thing he noticed was the depth of it. Phosphorescence lives at the surface, in the skin of the sea, and this lay far down below the keel, a broad, pale patch with soft, round edges, longer than the ship, and it was steady. It did not flicker, and it did not drift. It lay directly beneath the hull, a little forward of amidships, and it was still. He called the other man of the watch, and together they woke the mate. Hartley came forward in his singlet and looked over the side a long time without a word, then walked aft and looked from the taffrail, then came forward and looked again, and what he was doing. My grandfather understood years later, was proving to himself that the patch held its place under the vessel no matter where a man stood, which meant it was no reflection of anything aboard. It was pale, more white than green, and its light reached nothing. That was the detail my grandfather always made me sit with. A lamp sunk in water lights the water around it, and this lit nothing at all. The sea above it and beside it stayed black, and the patch itself simply showed, far down, with its clean, soft edges. And there was no telling how far down, because there was nothing near it to give it a size, only the guess that came of its lying under a 90-foot ship and showing wider than she was. Daylight left nothing to see, but Captain Rennie heard the account without laughing and had the deep-sea lead brought up. Its tallow-packed hull would carry back a print of sand, shell, or mud whenever it touched ground, yet the full 300 fathoms ran out and the lead swung free, returning with its tallow clean. No bottom lay beneath them for a mile and more, so the light seen at night rested on no ground and hung much nearer to the ship than any sea floor. The light returned on the next 2 nights, in the same place beneath her. Before dawn on the 6th morning, with the whole company aware of it, the boats towed the schooner nearly a mile toward a ruffle of air that came to nothing. The light went forward when the Winifred moved and stopped when her last trace of motion died, keeping it stationed beneath the hull without lag or drift. After the boats were hoisted in, it lay below in its place, and nobody said much because there was nothing sensible to add. That forenoon, Cole went aft and asked the master, quietly and in the ordinary line of duty, to keep the men off the bowsprit and the headgear at night, and Captain Rennie gave the order without asking his reasons, and no reasons were ever offered. The fishing over the side stopped on its own. The men had been taking small, bright dolphin fish on hand lines all through the calm, and after the 6th day, no line went over the rail, and nobody remarked on it. In every other particular, the Winifred kept her order exactly. Decks were washed down, brass was polished, wicks were trimmed, meals went along the swinging table, and the bells were struck through the night watches, soft. On the half hours, and my grandfather said that was the part no landsman would guess, how much comfort there is in brass and bells when something is underneath you. The master's log for those days reads, "Calm," and once, in the same small hand, "Light in the sea beneath the vessel, cause not known, and nothing more." The night watches measured it because seamen measure instead of wondering aloud. From one fixed place, the mate set its edges against the main shrouds and marked the relation in the back of his notebook, always under the same watch and from the same plank beside the rail. By the 8th night, the experienced watchers agreed that it had become slightly wider and clearer, which placed it nearer the surface. No change could be caught within one watch, yet across the week it had risen by a small patient amount. And my grandfather said the calm began to feel arranged, although in daylight he would admit that a doldrum's calm needed no arrangement. On the morning of the 10th day, the cat's paws came. Little dark trails of ruffled water walking up from the southeast, and by noon there was a true breeze, and the Winifred got her canvas on her and gathered way for the first time in 9 days. That night, with the schooner slipping south at 6 knots and the water talking down her side again, my grandfather went forward on his watch and looked over the rail. And the light was under her, still keeping pace, holding its place off the bow with the ship at her best speed in a month. He stood there a long while, and there was no measuring anything now, only the fact of it, below, moving when she moved. And at some hour of that night, at no moment anyone marked, it fell behind or went deeper, and in the morning, the sea was only the sea. None of them saw it go, because a man cannot watch water every minute, and the watch had its work. The southeast air held after that, and the Winifred returned to the measured business of passage, with canvas shortened before squalls, spread again beneath clear sky, and inspected each morning where 9 days of slatting had worked the stitching. Cole went aloft, with 2 men to serve a worn place on the forestay, while Hartley opened the hatches during dry hours so heat could leave the copru, and the sacks below shifted only enough to creak against one another when the schooner rolled. At noon, Captain Rennie brought the sun down to the horizon through his sextant, called the reading to the mate, and entered a position that moved south by a satisfying distance each day. The cook soaked salt meat, the deck watch drew fresh water by measure, and somebody always sat beneath the awning, repairing a palm or needle case that had suffered in the calm. At night, the bells divided one watch from another, and the men looked down when duty brought them to the rail, but no order told them to look, and no report followed when the water remained dark. Work filled the ship again, which was what work aboard a schooner was meant to do, and Va came nearer through every quiet entry in the log. They reached Suva 11 days later, discharged the copru, and Captain Rennie made no report beyond his log before the Winifred returned to trade. My grandfather later went into steam and then ashore, and he said storms had never troubled him because a busy sea was honest, while the calm remained with him. For 9 nights, something had lain beneath a stopped ship, matching every tow and drift without doing anything else, and that patience offered no want a man could name. In old age, he rowed the ferry across Auckland Harbor to Devonport on still evenings, with his hat resting on his knee, but always sat on the landward side, where he could not look straight down. I never heard him call the sea cruel, and I never saw him swim in it. That was the Winifred, held for 9 days in a calm, while a pale light kept its station beneath her. The deep sea lead found no bottom for more than a mile, yet the light moved forward during each tow, stopped with the schooner, and rose by a small measure across the passing nights. When the trade wind returned, it kept pace under sail until it fell behind unseen, leaving only one plain entry in the master's log. My grandfather never called the sea cruel afterward, although on still harbor crossings he chose a seat that kept him from looking straight down. From the heat of the doldrums we travel to barren Tickle on the northeast coast of Newfoundland, where Reuben Sully kept a fog alarm for 31 years. The horn gave one measured blast each minute whenever the coast disappeared, and an older keeper had left him a single unwritten rule concerning fog that came inland against a steady wind. My mother was born in 1929 at a fog alarm station on the northeast coast of Newfoundland, which was then a country of its own, poor in money and rich in weather. The station stood on a headland above barren Tickle, and at Tickle, there is a narrow run of salt water between an island and the shore, used by boats and weather alike. Her father, Reuben Sully, kept the alarm, and his story came to me in pieces across many evenings at my mother's kitchen table, until those pieces made a whole. A fog alarm station is a lighthouse for the ears. The white wooden building with its red roof held 2 oil engines, iron air tanks, and a compressed air horn called a diaphone, which gave a deep 2-part note and told vessels where the hidden coast stood. It sounded 1 3-second blast each minute while weather stayed thick, and my grandfather kept its engines oiled, wiped, and faithful for 31 years because the men offshore were owed a faithful horn. My mother and her brothers slept easily under it, yet when clearing weather let him stop the engines, the whole family stirred in the sudden quiet before settling again. Across the water lay the dozen households of barren Tickle, reached only by a coastal steamer every few weeks. The men salted cod in wharf sheds called stages and dried it on long spruce platforms called flakes, while a white church at the head of the water kept a bell for Sundays in bad weather. During summer, the stages stood busy from first light, and in autumn the empty flakes silvered under frost beside the dark water. Everybody in that harbor lived by the water and off it, so whatever the water did was noticed. My grandfather took the station over in 1921 from an old keeper named Rai-U Batten, who had held it for 30 years before him. And the handover was a government matter, an inventory signed in duplicate, so many gallons of kerosene, so many drums of engine oil, 1 clock, 1 barometer, 1 logbook. And when all of it was signed, as Rai-U gave him 1 instruction more, which was written nowhere. Fog on that coast, he said, comes in with easterly weather, off the cold water, and that fog is ordinary and honest, however long it sits. But once in a great while, he said, fog will come up the Tickle from seaward against the wind, with the wind standing steady out of the west, and the fog walking into the face of it. Low and even, and it will not thin at sunrise, and when that fog comes there will be a bell in it, and the bell is not to be answered, not with the church bell, and not with anything else. The horn would do its duty, because the horn was law, and fog, however it arrives, is still fog, but there was to be no answer. My grandfather thanked him and did not laugh, because a man who has kept a station for 30 years has earned a careful hearing, and then for 11 years, nothing came of it at all. My mother always explained that a vessel anchored in thick weather gives a brief, soft ringing about once each minute, which tells others that she is stopped, and they must keep clear. A bell inside fog was therefore expected and honest on that coast, and this was exactly what made the other bell wrong. In my grandfather's 31 years, the fog came against the wind 5 times, and my mother most often recalled October of 1938, when she was 9 and her brother Gordon was 11. After 2 bright days under a steady west wind, my grandfather saw the entire Tickle empty at first light, from the station landing to the open water beyond the point. By breakfast, low fog moved inland from seaward with the wind in its face, neither tumbling nor thinning, and the clear water shortened steadily behind its edge. He started the engines, and within an hour a small ship's bell began answering every horn blast, never early or late, although no vessel had entered the narrow passage beneath the occupied stageheads. The bell kept that exact answer through the day and the following night. The village continued its work because salted fish could wait and nobody rode into coastal fog without need. Kettles stayed warm, men mended twine in the stage lofts, and the children carried small errands between houses on paths they knew by foot. Through supper and long afterward, the horn kept its minutes while the bell answered, patient and correct, never loud or out of turn, and a stranger might have mistaken the exchange for two ordinary aides keeping one another company. The station had its own landing below the engine house, a slipway and a few steps of wharf, and on a bracket by the landing hung the handbell that was rung to call the men down when the government tender stood in with the year's coal and kerosene. On the second morning of that fog, Gordon was at the landing with a bucket, and he was 11, and he had grown his whole small life inside a pattern of sound and answer, horn and echo, knock and reply. And when the horn blasted above him and the bell rang somewhere out in the white, he reached up, not thinking anything a boy could be blamed for, and struck the landing bell twice, lightly. My grandfather was beside him inside of a moment. He did not shout, and he was not rough. He took the boy's wrist gently, set the bell quiet with his other hand, and turned him up the path. And the next time the horn sounded, the bell answered from close off the landing. It had been out in the middle of the tickle, better than half a mile of water away, and now its note was small and unhurried and near, low over the water just off the slip. And no oars had been heard crossing, and no sail and no engine either, and the water against the landing had never once changed its sound. The ringing was not louder for being near. My mother always said that, part in the same words every time. It was the same soft, correct ring it had been all along, only now it was close. They went up to the house, and the lamps were lit, and supper went on the table. And my grandfather went out on his rounds every hour through the evening and the night, into the engine room with the oil can, because the horn was owed its minutes, whatever else was in the weather. The bell stayed close off the landing the whole night, one ring for one blast, hour after hour, and nobody answered it. My mother lay in bed hearing it come small under the horn, and the strange mercy of it, she said, was that it never rang out of turn, and never rang twice, and made no other sound of any kind. No step, no voice, no bump of a hull against the slip, and somewhere in the smallest hours she went to sleep, because a child can sleep through anything that keeps its rhythm. By morning, the west wind still held, while the fog drew back toward the sea at the pace of its arrival, with the bell answering from steadily farther away until its last ring came beyond the point. At noon, the tickle lay blue and empty from the stages to open water, and after my grandfather stopped the engines, the family stirred at the quiet. His log recorded 34 hours of thick weather, and nothing more, because the government columns carried spaces for engine hours and fuel gallons, but not for the rest. The station resumed its ordinary seasons after that entry, and most fog arrived from the east with damp on the windows and a familiar change in the smell of the air. Reuben tested each engine before weather required it, drained water from the air tanks, polished the governor links with an oily cloth, and kept spare belts hanging where mice could not reach them. When the horn began, one child watched the pressure gauge while another carried tea from the house, and the measured blast passed over the tickle until every household folded it into work and sleep. The government tender brought fuel drums, lamp oil, flour, and mail on clear days, and its engineer stayed long enough to listen to both machines before signing the station book. On Sundays, the family crossed by boat for service whenever the sea allowed, and Gordon kept his hands in his pockets while the church bell was rung, with nobody drawing attention to the choice. Years of honest fog came and went around those habits, sometimes for an hour and sometimes for several days, and the horn never missed its appointed minute. The other fog returned only rarely, which left the unwritten rule resting quietly among all the written duties of the station. No harm came then or later, and Gordon became master of a longliner but left every bell to other hands, while a small harbor allowed him that one refusal without asking for an account. After the station became automatic, my mother carried the rule to St. Bede, John's, where in fog she stood at the window and knew every harbor horn by voice. She said that a bell was only telling where it stood, so the safe and mannerly answer was silence, and she could sleep through every sound the city made, while a sound stopping woke her all her life. That was the fog above Barren Tickle, moving from seaward while a west wind pressed directly against it. A ship's bell hidden in the whiteness answered every blast from the station horn, although the narrow harbor had been empty and no vessel had entered beneath the watching stageheads. When young Gordon Sully touched the landing bell twice, the answering note moved from the middle of the tickle to the water beside the slip, where it continued softly until morning. The fog later withdrew against the wind, and Gordon became a capable longliner captain who left every bell to other hands. The next account goes north to Skarvika in Norway's Lofoten 10 Islands, where families have worked the winter cod grounds beyond all written memory. An hour from the cove lies a half-mile patch called the Smooth, and every generation kept its fishing gear outside the clean boundary of that water. My mother's mother was born in 1901 in Lofoten, a chain of steep Norwegian islands 100 miles above the Arctic Circle, where mountains rise directly from the sea, and winter darkness gives way to summer nights full of light. Her people kept a small farm above Skarvika, a cove of 5 houses, 1 boathouse, and a thin meadow running toward the mountain. They kept cows and sheep, raised potatoes, and depended most of all upon the water because the meadow was poor and the fishing grounds were not. My grandmother Astrid left for Canada in 1929 and recalled the farm across 50 years of kitchen evenings. And this is the part she told about the water. Every winter, the skrei, the great Arctic cod, come down from the Barents Sea to spawn among Lofoten, and for 3 months, the coast turns out to meet them. In my grandmother's girlhood, the open wooden boats were sailed and rowed, built to a form already old when the local church was new. Visiting fishermen slept in red waterfront cabins called roorbu, and the split catch dried on pole racks called yell until it became hard, light stockfish that could keep for years. In March, the full racks gave the wind a low wooden singing across the shore, and she missed that sound throughout her life in Canada. The winter days had one shape, and the shape was the comfort of them. The men rowed out in the dark before the late dawn and set their long lines and hauled what the day gave and came home ahead of the early dusk. And the fish were split and salted or hung the same evening. And the boys carried coffee down to the boats and were rowing themselves before they were tall. Her father tapped the weather glass, which is the barometer, first thing every morning of his life. And then he looked at the mountain, because when the mountain wore its cloud low on the shoulders, no boat went out, and the sea got that day to itself. On those shore days, the lines were spread for repair, cork floats were checked, and worn oars were dressed with oil beside the stove. In the evenings, the household knitted and mended by lamplight, and the boats stood hauled out or swung at their moorings below, and the water in the cove worked quietly among the stones all night, which was the sound they all slept inside without knowing they heard it. Beyond the last low skerries, an hour's rowing from the cove, lies a patch of sea half a mile across that the family called slet. The Norwegian word for a flat place, and in English they called it the smooth. Although no chart marks it, and the printed depth remains 80 fathoms throughout the surrounding water, its surface is different. A chop dies at its clean edge, and even during a gale the swell crosses it round, backed and unbroken without a white cap inside. From the mountain pasture on a still summer night, it shows pale against the darker water, and seabirds gather at its boundary, but not within it. The rule of the family, and in time of the whole cove, was that no line, net, or anchor went into the smooth. A boat might cross it while traveling elsewhere, although most men went around without ever deciding together to do so, and no gear entered that water in any winter, however thin the fishing ran. The rule came down from Astrid's great-grandfather, a man named Niels, who was born sometime in the 1820s, and whatever had begun, it was already 2 generations out of memory by the time my grandmother was a girl. Asking about it brought one answer, given kindly and given once, which was that the ground was spoken for, and although nobody could say who had spoken for it, the old people never felt they lacked anything they needed to know. The rule was neither threat nor superstition in the household. It belonged beside tending the weather glass and bringing the boats home before the early winter dark. the great winters, the boats came from every district in the north, and hundreds of sails worked the grounds beyond Skar, Ka from the dark morning until the early dusk. Strangers learned the rule without ever being taught it, because fishermen watch the boats that are finding cod, and the fishing remained good along both edges of the smooth without improving inside it. The fleet therefore worked east and west of the Pale Water, and its long line bent around that half-mile all season. From the mountain, the curve could be seen beneath the late winter light, carried by boats whose crews had never discussed it together. The rule was tested in February of 1927 by Johan, a capable visiting skipper from the outer island of Veroy. During a thin fishing year, he rowed across flat evening water, set 2 nets in the smooth, and returned to his rorbu. In the morning, the floats remained exactly where he had left them, although the tidal current always moves fishing gear by some visible amount, and men in the nearby boats noticed that stillness before the first net rose. When Johan hauled, the meshes came up without fish or weed, and with their old twine pail. His repairs remained exactly where he knew them, yet the smell and wear of 12 winters had gone, leaving the mending cord newly spun and every knot clean. He turned the dry-feeling mesh across his forearm for a long while before coiling it into the boat without comment. The water inside the smooth had held those nets all night without touching them, so he set them 2 miles east the next evening, where they returned wet, heavy, strongly scented, and full, which was the proper condition of working gear. Nothing further came of it, which is the part my grandmother emphasized, because Johan suffered no ill luck and fished 20 more winters before dying old in his own bed at Veroy. He never set gear inside the smooth again, and never spoke beyond what the other men had seen. And the cove did not turn his choice into a tale of punishment. The water had not harmed him, but had quietly and completely declined his work. And a fisherman does not need such a refusal twice. Engines came in the 30s and echo sounders after the war, machines that marked the bottom on a moving strip of paper. One of my mother's young cousins ran such a sounder back and forth across the smooth during a bright summer day, half embarrassed by his own curiosity, until the paper showed an ordinary bottom at 80 fathoms throughout. This settled nobody because the rule had never rested on the bottom, and the water itself went on being smooth. The machines changed the shape of a fishing day without changing its purpose, because engines carried the boats out before dawn and deck lamps let the catch be worked after the early winter dark. Men still rose to a weather glass and a mountain cloud, warmed their hands around coffee in the boathouse, and handled each line until a damaged swivel or rough length of cord could be found by touch. Before departure, they checked the bilge, fuel, knives, gaffs, and the wooden boxes that held food, and on returning they washed salt from the deck while the engine ticked itself cool. During the stockfish season, families moved between shore and racks with barrows, turning and sorting the drying catch whenever weather demanded it, while the smell of cod and clean wind filled the cove. Children learned the names of the grounds from the adults' daily talk, and the smooth entered those lessons only as a bend in the course and an empty place on the setting plan. Nobody lost a day's work by leaving it empty, because the cod came well along its boundary, and a rule that costs nothing soon becomes part of skill rather than a subject for argument. In that form, it passed easily from sail to engine and from hand lead to sounding paper. farm went out of the family in the 60s, and the cove is summer houses now, but the scrae still come every winter, and the racks still fill, and the sheep still go up to the mountain pasture in June. From up there, in the light night, with the sun lying low and red in the north, the smooth still shows, a paler patch with a clean edge, out past the skerries, always in its place. The boats working those grounds are steel now, bright with electric lamps and fitted with instruments that mark both bottom and fish, yet most still go around it. The young men say the tide sets badly there, while their great-grandfathers said the ground was spoken for, and both answers preserve the rule without demanding belief. The water inside lies flat in all weathers, holding whatever it holds, and it asks nothing, takes nothing, and gives back only gear relieved of its years. Above the cove the houses stand dark in the light night, the boats swing at their moorings, and everyone sleeps. That was the smooth beyond Scarby Ka, where a chop ends at the boundary and no whitecap rises within it. The family rule barred every line, net and anchor, although nobody still remembered more than the statement that the ground was spoken for. In 1927, a visiting skipper named Johan left 2 seasoned nets there overnight and hauled them back empty, pale, and stripped of a dozen winters of wear, with every repair newly clean. The water caused him no harm, and he accepted its quiet refusal, while modern boats still bend their courses around the flat patch. We now come south to the Goodwin Sands off Kent, England, and to the lightship that once held her station above that shifting bank. Through the winter of 1936, every proper count struck on her watch bell received a soft answer from below the waterline, 1 beat behind. My grandfather served 7 winters aboard the lightship, marking the southern end of the Goodwin Sands off Kent, in southeastern England, and he always began with the ship herself. A lightship goes nowhere. She is built heavy and plain, with neither working sails nor an engine for passage, then towed to a danger that cannot hold a lighthouse and moored there by a great chain. Every other vessel is bound toward a destination, while her entire duty through every night of the year is to burn a light and remain exactly where she was left. The danger beneath her was the Goodwin Sands, a 10-mile bank a few miles off, deal in the narrow water between England and France, where a large part of the world's shipping passed close by. A laden ship can touch the bank before anyone sees it, although at quiet, low-water parts rise into pale, rippled hills, where deal boatmen once landed for games before the returning tide covered the whole country of sand. The soft, deep bank lowers stranded vessels over seasons and years until a last masthead ceases to show, and what the Goodwins take, they keep. My grandfather joined her 7-man company in the winter of 1936 under Trinity House, the corporation that keeps English sea marks. A tender brought relief hands, lamp oil, and mail every few weeks, and between visits routine filled the month at one mooring. The lantern was tended, brass polished, the fog engine tested each morning, and the weather entered in ink after every watch. Each half hour, the watch struck the old sea count on the bell, rising from 1 to 8 before beginning again. So a man waking in darkness knew the hour without opening his eyes. On his first evening aboard, an older hand, a lamplighter named Walter Legg, told him about the taps, and he used the same voice he had used a minute earlier, telling him which peg was his and where the tea was kept. When the bell was struck, Walter said there would be an answer. It would come from below, quiet, a small knocking against the hull, and it would give back the same count the bell had given, 1 beat behind. Nobody aboard would remark on it, because it had been answering at that station since before any man now in the service. And the one thing worth knowing about it, Walter said, was that it kept an honest count, and always had. At midnight it proved true, because after the watch struck 8 bells and the last note crossed the water, a small stillness opened, and 8 soft knocks answered from below the waterline, unhurried and even. Each quiet knock could have been missed across a room, and my grandfather counted them at the cold rail, while the man beside him continued filling his pipe. At the next half hour, the count returned again with complete accuracy, and by dawn, it had already entered the ordinary sequence of his watch. He always said that the strangeness of it never lived in the sound itself, which was a mild sound, and on a long watch, even a companionable one. The strangeness lived in the plain arithmetic of where the sound was. The taps came from the outside of the plating, below the waterline, and on the outside of that plating there was nothing but the North Sea, a dozen fathoms of it, a fathom being 6 feet of water, and under the water there was the sand. There was nothing out there to stand on, and nothing out there to knock with, and the taps came anyway, every half hour of every watch, in every weather of the winter, and in his 7 years aboard, they were never early, and they were never once wrong. There was one custom about the bell, kept so long that nobody thought of it as a rule anymore. The bell was struck when the watch required it, and never otherwise. It was not struck to show a visitor, It was not struck for a joke by a new man, and it was never, under any persuasion, struck out of its time. Because every count was answered. That much had been settled long ago, and the crews of that station had decided among themselves, generations back, that they preferred a world in which every answer had its question. My grandfather kept the custom without effort, all his time aboard, and he said it was the easiest rule he ever kept, because once a man has heard the answer, he finds he has no appetite left for asking anything further. As to what it was, the men of the service did not speculate much, and my grandfather less than most. The good ones have been given a great many ships, he would say, and there were men in those ships, men of his own trade who had stood watches and struck bells in their own time, and that is as far as anyone aboard ever took the matter out loud. Whatever kept the count below them kept it properly, and a count struck and answered is the oldest courtesy of the watch. They did not fear it, he said, and they did not exactly not fear it either. They kept the light, and it kept the count, and the two duties ran on side by side all winter without once interfering with each other. Only once did he go looking any closer. It was a flat, calm night in the January of his second winter, with frost on the rails, and the light turning steadily overhead, and the sea so still that he could hear the tide working over the sands themselves, a soft, low seething, a mile off in the dark. He had the middle watch, and at 2 a.m. he struck 4 bells, and while the answer was still to come, he went quickly and quietly down the ladder into the forepeak, which is the narrow space in the bow of a ship, below the waterline, where the plating stands bare with no lining over it, and he laid his palm flat against the cold iron. The 4 taps came, quiet and unhurried, and he felt each one arrive through the iron under his hand, and the 3rd of them came directly beneath his palm, and he took his hand away, and the 4th came where his hand had been. He climbed back up to the deck and finished his watch, and he struck the bell at each half hour to the end of it, and each count was answered, 1 beat behind, honest and mild. He never put his hand to the plating again, and he never spoke of it aboard, and nothing changed between him and the ship, or between him and the sands, except that from that night, he understood that the answer was not an echo, and was not any settling of the iron, because an echo keeps no count, and iron does not know where a man's hand is resting. His remaining winters were built from the work that keeps a stationary vessel sound, since staying in one place is hard service for chain, hull, and crew. Each morning the watch recorded wind, visibility, and the set of the tide, then tried the fog engine while the cook cleared breakfast and the lamplighter cleaned the lantern glass. Rust was chipped from the deck fittings in dry weather. Paint followed the chipping, and the mooring cable was watched for any change in its lead over the bow as the tide turned. The tender's arrival brought coal, lamp oil, vegetables, newspapers, and relief hands, along with an hour of voices not already known by their footsteps overhead. After it left, the lightship settled again to 7 men, the turning lantern, and the bell dividing each watch into portions that could be carried without effort. During gales, the great chain trembled and the hull worked at her station, while on calm days, men mended clothes, read old mail, and watched shipping pass through the Downs toward London or the Channel. Through all of it, the answering taps remained 1 beat behind the required count, and because they never interrupted a duty or altered a reading, the log held weather, stores, and maintenance without a column for them. He left the service during the Second War and lived out his life in Deal, where on clear days, low water showed him the pale line of the sands far beyond his window. Automatic buoys eventually replaced the lightships, and some carried bells that gave a loose count whenever the swell moved them, without a watch standing behind the sound. My grandfather considered this change for a long while, and said only that a bell keeping no count had nothing that needed answering, which was probably just as well. That was the honest count aboard the Goodwin lightship, where each half-hour bell was answered through the hull, and not one answer failed in 7 winters. The crew never struck the bell outside its proper watch, because they preferred every answer to have an orderly cause. On one flat January night, my grandfather placed his hand against the bare iron in the forepeak, and the 3rd tap arrived beneath his palm, while the 4th followed the hand after he withdrew it. He returned to the deck, kept the watch without alteration, and never searched for anything further. Our next account belongs to Thibault Rurn on the Danish coast in 1958, where gear from stranded vessels was sold openly beneath the wreckmaster's eye. Among the lots from the steamer, Fenwood, stood a mahogany chronometer, and an old skipper named Niels Brandt carried it home for less than the cost of a coil of rope. I had this story from a Danish marine engineer named Eric, and he had it from the man involved, which brings the telling close to its source. It belongs to Teboø, a fishing town where the broad Limfjord opens through Jutland's west coast into the North Sea. Sand and dune grass run along that shore without protective rock, and the town has always lived partly from what the sea leaves there. Ships come ashore there on long shifting sandbars, and a vessel caught upon them is seldom freed. When one was abandoned, a state wreckmaster sold its recovered gear at public auction, where farmers, fishermen, and town dealers bought useful rope and timber. A careful buyer could carry home sound manila rope for the price of poor string, and families saved oak and teak fittings for boats, barns, and household repairs. It was an orderly market in the wind, with every lot entered by a clerk, and everything in this account happened in daylight with receipts. Niels Brandt had skippered his own boat from Teboø for more than 30 years, and by 1958 he had given it to his son while keeping a rowing boat and the habits of work. He rose early, wound the clocks, sharpened his tools before they needed sharpening, and maintained everything he owned in quiet order. He attended each auction for rope, sound timber, and the company of a harper where nearly every person he had known stood nearby in the wind. That spring's goods came from the Fenwood of Sunderland, the English shipbuilding town on the River Wear. The steamer had entered a still December fog without wind and settled onto the bar so gently that men below felt nothing, and only the stopped engines told them she was held. Her crew waited for low water, stepped down onto firm sand, and walked toward the lights of Teboø without injury. The Fenwood remained upright and whole half a mile out, showing her masts and funnel above the morning water. But each tide raised more sand around her, and by March the underwriters abandoned her and sent her removable gear to auction. Among the goods was a chronometer, the exact clock a navigator keeps on Greenwich time and compares with the sun to find his position east or west. A ship might carry many clocks, but this one measure of time crossed the whole voyage without being altered to local noon. The trusted instrument sat in a mahogany box on rings called gimbals, which kept it level while the ship rolled, and it had to be wound at the same hour each day. The Fenwood's English-made clock was 40 years old, its brass was sound, and because no instrument dealer attended, Niels bought it for less than a coil of rope. He set it on a parlor dresser away from the stove, because heat disturbs a clock, and wound it after coffee at the same hour each morning. From working habit, he began to rate it, which means comparing a chronometer each day with trusted time and recording its drift. At the noon wireless signal, Niels wrote the date and seconds of error in a school notebook, one small pencil line each day, although he had no voyage to navigate and no practical need for the result. By midsummer, the notebook had something to tell him. A chronometer may run fast and it may run slow, and either is perfectly honest because the error of a good clock is steady, and a steady error is as good as no error to a man who knows its size. What a clock must not do is change its mind, and his was changing its mind twice a day. It gained through part of the day and gave the whole of the gain back through the rest, gently and evenly. And when he sat down one evening and worked out the length of one full swing of it, the answer came out at 12 hours and 25 minutes. There is no wheel and no spring in any clockwork on earth that keeps that period. And there is one thing in the world that does keep it, and that thing is the tide. From one high water to the next, on every coast of the ocean, is 12 hours and 25 minutes, and the chronometer off the Fenwood was keeping it. So he did what a skipper does with a question of navigation, and took it to the tables. He borrowed the tide tables from the harbor office, the printed books that give the hour of high water for the ports of the sea, and he set his notebook open beside them. And the first thing they told him was that his clock was not keeping the tide at Tebow-Rurn because its hours of gaining stood well out of step with the water at the end of his own street. So he worked along the tables, port by port, patiently, and the fit, when he came to it, was the River Wear at Sunderland. The clock was keeping the tide of the water the Fenwood had been built beside, the rise and fall of her own home river, carried across in a mahogany box, and going on quietly in a parlor in Jutland twice a day to the schedule of water 400 miles away. He told nobody for a while, and he kept his small lines of pencil going, and through the late summer the figures began, very slowly, to walk. The swing of the clock was leaving Sunderland's hours, a few minutes in a week, never hurrying, and one evening in September, he laid the weeks out side by side on the kitchen table and saw where the walking led. The swing was coming into step, so much a week, with the tide on the bar outside the town, with the water that stood over the Fenwood's decks twice a day, half a mile from where he sat. The clock was letting go of the river where she had been built, and it was learning the tide of the sand where she lay. Niels was not fanciful, and nothing he did next came from panic. He considered the matter through autumn, then, on a flat October morning, wound the clock fully and rowed outside the bar to the Fenwood's exposed masts and funnel. Beside her quiet plates, he tied the box to new cod line bought at her auction, lowered it until the line went slack below, and released the end. He sat with his hands on his knees beside the settling ship before rowing home in time for dinner, and that was the whole ceremony. After dinner, he washed the salt from his oarlocks, turned the rowing boat over on its trestles, and put the remaining cod line into the dry locker, because returning an object did not excuse leaving tools unattended. The empty place on the parlor dresser gathered a clean rectangle of dust around it for several days, and then his wife moved a framed photograph into the space without discussion. Niels kept the rating notebook in the drawer with old boat accounts, where its pencil columns remained available, but no longer needed another line. His mornings returned to coffee, harbor weather, and small repairs brought by neighbors who trusted his hands with a pump, compass box, or worn brass fitting, although he declined clocks and watches with the plain statement that another man would serve them better. When his son came in from fishing, they discussed catches, fuel, and the shifting bar, and through winter they walked down together to inspect the Fenwood whenever low water left enough of her visible. Each month, the sand held more of the steamer, while tides entered and withdrew from her open spaces on their local hours, and Niels made no calculation of those hours because the harbor office already kept the proper tables. Niels attended auctions for the rest of his life and bought excellent rope and timber, but never another instrument. He did not turn the chronometer into a public story, and Eric needed a winter of evenings before the old man gave him the account without adding weight to its ending. Niels nevertheless left Tebow-Rurn one saying that older men repeated over brass on the trestles before leaving it to the dealers. Rope forgets where it has been. and brass does not. That was Niels Brandt and the Finnwoods chronometer, which gained and lost on a period of 12 hours and 25 minutes. Its changing error first followed the tide of the River Wear at Sunderland, where the steamer had been built, and then moved slowly toward the hours of the water covering her on the Danish sandbar. On a calm October morning, Niels wound the clock, rowed to the settling hull, and lowered the mahogany box until the cod line went slack. He returned to the auctions for rope and timber, but left every instrument to others, saying that rope forgets where it has been, and brass does not. One account remains, and it returns to the flat November water east of Sable Island. The Almadon and the Speedwell are waiting there again, with the clouds held in the calm sea and the oars crossing the distance between them, while the first story is told once more in the slower hours of the night. The night comes back around to where it began, on a flat, calm morning in the North Atlantic in November of 1884, east of Sable Island, beside a bark called the Almadon of Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. By this hour, the words may have gone soft, and that is no matter, because the account needs only water, a ship, and a morning without wind, and all three are waiting where we left them. Yarmouth is a town at the western end of Nova Scotia on the Atlantic coast of Canada, and in those years, it was a town made of ships. It was said then that for its size, no place on earth owned more of them, and whether the saying was strictly true or only nearly true, the town looked the part. With sail lofts and rope walks standing along the harbor, and ships' portraits hanging in the front rooms of the captain's houses, and at any hour you cared to name, half the men of the county were away on saltwater. The Almadon was one of that fleet, a bark, which is a sailing ship of 3 masts with square sails on the first 2, and she was named in the manner of that coast. Out of the family that held the most shares in her, and she was well found and well kept, deep laden that November and outward bound across the Atlantic, some days out on her passage. Her course carried her east of Sable Island, and Sable Island will bear saying again, slowly. It is a long, low bar of bare sand, far out in the open Atlantic off Nova Scotia, with grass on its dunes and wild ponies living on the grass, and neither harbor nor tree from one end of it to the other. And the men of that coast learned early to give it a wide and respectful berth, because the water around it runs shoal for miles, and the fogs there sit long. The Almadon passed it well clear to the southward and stood on east, and behind her the wind began to fall away, and it fell away gently through a day and a night, and by the second morning there was none. A flat calm in a sailing ship is enforced rest, and there is no rest more complete, because nothing can be done about a calm, and nothing is expected of anybody but patience. The sea that morning had gone to glass, with a long, slow swell moving under the glass, so slow it was more remembered than seen, and the water carried every cloud in it, whole and unbroken. Her sails hung slack from the yards, and when the swell tilted her, the blocks tapped softly against the masts, and were still again, and the watch washed down the decks. Because decks are washed down whether a ship is going anywhere or not. And the smell of coffee came aft from the galley, and the master stood at the rail with the morning, and there was nowhere in the world for anyone aboard to be but exactly where they were. Three miles off her bow across that glass stood a brigantine, a smaller rig of 2 masts with square sails on the foremast. She carried one topsail while the rest of her canvas was furled with care. Her yards were squared, and no signal lifted above the deck. Captain Reuben Don studied her through the long glass and found the wheel unattended, yet every other visible detail belonged to a vessel managed by competent hands, which was the first quiet contradiction of the morning. They ran up their ensign and received no answer, and after the hail traveled out and died, the mate, Obed Can, took Amos Treffery and a young Danish sailor in the boat. Their oars were the only sound across those 3 miles, with water falling from the blades between each unhurried stroke, and whenever they rested, the open Atlantic offered no sound at all. Under the brigantine's quarter they hailed twice more, received only silence, and read her name and home port in good gilt letters, Speedwell of St. John's. Obed and Treffery climbed aboard while the Dane kept the boat off, and they stood listening on a dry deck where every line was coiled on its pin. The hatches were battened, and the wheel was secured with a neat piece of small rope. Both boats remained beneath laced covers on their chocks, which meant the missing company had not taken the ordinary means of leaving. In the forecastle, the bunks were made, oilskins hung above sea boots, and a half-mended jersey still held its needle. Below, 4 places stood ready at the cabin table, with the fiddles fitted around the dishes, while the galley kettle rested on the stove, and when Obed laid the back of his hand against it, he found it warm. On the cabin table, beside the laid places, lay the ship's log, and a log is the book of a voyage. Written up in ink at the end of each day, with the position and the weather and the sail carried in a settled hand, so that the voyage exists on paper as surely as it exists on water. The Speedwell's log was kept in good ink and an even hand, day following day with nothing amiss in any one of them, and it stopped in the middle of a sentence. The date at the head of that unfinished page was 11 days old. And that is the whole of it, told slow, this time the same quiet sum that would not come out that morning and has never come out since, because the log was 11 days old and the kettle was still warm. They searched from the forepeak to the lockers below the cabin, and everything remained in good order while nothing offered an answer. Salt fish lay dry in the hold, the pumps brought no bilge water, and the crew's belongings kept their places. The chronometer had run down, the bread had hardened, and every measure aboard agreed with 11 days except the live coal found beneath the galley ash. No person could be found aboard, and at this late hour the wrongness can remain in that bright, calm morning with the unfinished log and the cooling kettle needing no closer attention. Obed and Treffery returned to the Almadon, where Captain Reuben Don asked for men to work the Sound brigantine toward Halifax. A salvage share could have exceeded a year's wages, but nobody accepted, and the captain did not press sailors who had heard about the warm kettle. The bark stood by through the afternoon, and when a small southwest air arrived after dark, the Speedwell began to move under her single topsail. Bed kept the middle watch from midnight until 4, with a lamp burning in his own rigging and the stranger visible off the quarter. Cloud lowered late in the watch and hid her from view, and at daylight she was gone. Captain Don calculated the course the breeze should have given her and searched it with men at the mastheads until noon, then returned to the Liverpool Passage, and the Speedwell was never reported again. The Almadon carried her spruce onward, and passage routine closed around the empty place left on the horizon, with sails changed for weather, watches relieved, the chronometer wound, and each noon position entered in the master's book. At Liverpool, Captain Don went ashore to make his deposition, and the report passed to Lloyd's in London, where arrivals, overdue vessels, and losses were kept upon the shipping lists. The Speedwell's owners in St. John's received notice, and in the fullness of winter the underwriters paid upon the vessel, and the 8 men of her company were given up with her. No inquiry could go much farther because there was no wreck to examine, no surviving hand to question, and no faults shown aboard the Sound brigantine. Obed returned to ordinary voyages and later to a house where an anchor served as the doorstop. But Kitchens never became entirely ordinary again, because he touched the back of his hand to each kettle on passing. His family let the gesture remain unmentioned, and when he banked the stove before bed, he did it carefully enough that any warmth found in the morning would have a known beginning. So the lasting picture remains the morning view of both ships on flat, bright water east of Sable Island. With the Almadan's people quiet at the rail and the Speedwell riding easy nearby, tidy and dry, her table laid and her kettle cooling with no one aboard to receive its warmth. The water carried each cloud without breaking it, and nothing moved except the long southern swell beneath the hulls. The calm held through the day, the sea kept what it knew, and by the following morning only the bark remained upon that water. And that is where the night leaves us, back east of Sable Island, with the Almadan standing by and the Speedwell riding easily nearby. Her deck is dry, her covered boats remain aboard, and below them, the table waits beside a log dated 11 days earlier and a kettle whose warmth belongs to that morning. Obed! Can returns to his own ship. The small breeze enters after dark, and by daylight, the empty brigantine has passed beyond every masthead search. The calm has held all these accounts. The kept lamp on Corby Rock, the warm clay from Alaska, the pale light beneath the Winifred, the bell inside, barren tickle fog, the untouched nets from the Smooth, the honest count below the lightship, and the chronometer returned to the Fenwood. None required an explanation in order to remain remembered, and the people who came home carried each one to the ordinary routines of later life. The stories are finished now, while slow water continues along the hull, and the distant wind remains low, leaving only the quiet sea through the last part of the night.